with American Vapor Manufacturers, and we are back with another installment of our Shaping Vaping podcast, where we talk about issues and policies and the public discourse around vape policy. And I'm delighted, as ever, to have back Joe Gitchell from Pinion Associates. Uh, in my view, one of the sharpest, most astute thinkers on vaping policy, and we're going to talk today about the forecast for 2025 and perhaps beyond, where vape policy is headed and what we think is going to unfold. And um, I think you'd agree to kick off with some concurrence, Joe, that this has been a pretty monumental year, 2024 in the last few months especially, and portends a lot of important changes for vape policy. Do you feel like this is one of the most, I don't know, one of the most significant inflection points in recent years, or am I living too much in the present in that perspective?
So it's a good question, and I think uh, how a lot of people consider this moment is going to have a big impact, which is put me on the cover of Flair for the Intuitive Obvious. But um, I, my personal view is that this week changed a lot, and it's a rare opportunity. Uh, and I've been saying it's a rare opportunity to make new mistakes. Um, I know that there will be missteps and errors, but I would love to think that we could come at this opportunity collectively with that spirit.
Well, I think what you're most alluding to, if I intuit it correctly, is the decision from the Food and Drug Administration this week that they will move forward with the rulemaking process on what's called very low nicotine, in which they would decree that uh, combustible tobacco products have a very small uh, level of allowable nicotine, and that's huge. I mean, that's been a dream of a lot of people in tobacco control for quite a long time. Um, and here's where our paths shall diverge, because I know you're enthusiastic about it, and I myself was appalled to see it, and I think it's extremely wrong-headed. So tell me, why, Joe, why should our listeners be rejoicing about that?
So here would be my argument, and I'm doing this off the top of my head because it's been a week. Um, I would encourage us to not just look at what happened Wednesday, but to look at Thursday too. And that was the authorization of all the PMTAs for Zyn.
Right, that's
Um,
the pouch. Those are the pouch products made by Philip Morris International.
I think that those together suggest a that's the opportunity that Gottlieb and Zeller laid out with their comprehensive plan in 2017 that had been talked about since the mid 90s under like the Benningfield idea. And again, there are lots of frames through which to view the rulemaking. One is as this extraordinary intrusion of the regulatory state into millions of people's lives. Um, and it's going to be tough for people who view the world in a certain way to see it as anything but that. And uh, I, I don't see the world that way, but that's just because I look through different frames. Mine aren't better or worse; they're just different. But I see this as the potential culmination of the promise of product regulation in one of the few areas of consumer products where it hasn't been brought to bear.
Yeah,
Um, if it's okay, I had a thought,
please.
and the thought was to go back to something that Lillian Ortega said at GTNF in September. And it
Please.
really it hit me at the time. I tried to live tweet it. I garbled the words, but the sentiment was that the goal of a regulator is voluntary compliance. And that just like slammed me as I've never thought of it that way. And yet that is perfect. That is absolutely perfect in terms of what I would wish for. And the way to think about that is the point of the regulator is not to have, what was the line in the fights over dietary supplements in the 90s? Jackbooted thugs are going to crash in and take your
Right.
vitamin C.
All right.
But to have the players in a marketplace understand that everyone's interests are well served if everyone's playing by the same set of rules.
Well,
And
I'll be sure to pass
so,
that advice along to our members when they meet the FBI agents that Brian King has sent out uh, to help instruct them.
so I think that's a mark of a failed regulatory framework.
But isn't
And
that
if,
exactly what they've done with VLN? I mean, CBS News had an interesting write-up on it, which I noticed which you praised. I thought it was a thorough piece, but I couldn't help noticing the reporter, who's a rookie reporter, in the lead of the article and throughout, correctly and accurately, used the phrase "FDA will force Americans to quit cigarettes," and that is I don't know, hard to reconcile that with the notion of voluntary regulation you're describing.
well, I would say if if this rule goes into effect and the way that it goes into effect is via enforcement, it will not succeed. You know, this is not a country and a culture that responds well to authority imposing its will. Like we have a country because we're the people who didn't really appreciate that concept.
Last summer, Joe, you'll recall the New York Times ran a splashy feature on its Sunday Styles section about how smoking is becoming cool again. And it featured a number of young, attractive New York City downtown, what they called sigfluencers. Quoted throughout the article was the head of a boutique cigarette company called Hestia, which, unlike the large players, is open, loud, I would say even obnoxiously pro cigarette, and talks about all of its, supposed virtues and allure. What do you imagine will happen if the VLN rule goes through and FDA gets its way, and the Hestia guys say, you know what, we're too cool for school, we're going to keep making cigarettes the old-fashioned way? I mean, how else will that rule have any meaning at all unless Brian King sends his FBI colleagues, as he's been bragging to Congress he's keen to do?
So if we've we've run that experiment, and that is the current vape marketplace and increasingly the pouch marketplace. The authorizations of Zyn are kind of an interesting natural experiment.
Yeah.
And if my presumption is correct, I think we will start to see a pretty dramatic drift away from not compliant pouch products towards the authorized ones. And that will show to everybody who's paying attention that there are actual advantages to playing by these rules. And as that virtuous cycle repeats, the opportunity that any brand will have to divide those rules will diminish to irrelevance.
But
I believe.
aren't you overlooking something important here? I mean, the current number of players at the kitchen table playing that regulatory board game for pouches is one. And in order to get a seat at that table, you have to go through a regulatory steeplechase that makes chutes and ladders look like tic-tac-toe. So won't the
So,
other players, as you point out in the experiment that we've run on vaping, correctly conclude to themselves, this is rigged, it's stacked against me, I don't have the money to spend that these large incumbent players do, my customers want this product, and you know what? Damn the torpedoes, I'm going to sell it to them.
and that will be the calculus if this um, uh, umbrella of voluntary compliance isn't put over our heads. That's a crap metaphor, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. Um, the point of voluntary compliance is that incentives are aligned across all the stakeholders. And that's the way it mostly works for medicines in this country. That's the way it mostly works for devices. And it's possible for nicotine and tobacco products, I believe. And uh, I didn't do my disclosures, consult for Jewel on vaping,
Right.
work on non-tobacco, non-combustible nicotine products for Philip Morris International. But other important disclosures, I believe that an FDA can improve health and improve the opportunities for business players.
Well,
Um,
that deserves a whole other series of episodes for you and me. For now,
yes, yes,
let me talk about this one slice because we've actually run this experiment on very low nicotine cigarettes before too. Uh, for the last 15 plus years, the FDA has been heavily investing in a company called 22nd Century,
yep.
which makes a very low nicotine cigarette, the only product commercially manufactured today that meets that standard FDA wishes to impose on everyone. Uh, they have FDA has bought millions and millions of cigarettes from this company, propped it up, touted it commercially, used their PR arm to help this private company boost their profile. They've gotten
Mhm,
front page fawning coverage from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CBS, on
mhm.
and on and on, have hyped this product. And you know what? Woe betide any investors who actually took that news coverage seriously or believed FDA, because that company went from a stock market high price of $50 a share just 18 months ago and is now at selling for a penny on the NASDAQ on the verge of bankruptcy. So hasn't the VLN standard, hasn't that, notion that smokers might find this product appealing been tried and proven to be a colossal failure?
I think that's a fair description of the events. I actually would flip it and say the lack of success in the marketplace of their products is actually proof of the promise of this as a product standard. A product standard that is put into place for cigarettes and certain other combustible tobacco products, as laid out in the proposed rule, will have health benefits if the number of compliant products rolling off of machines declines rapidly over time to nothing. The only way these products advance health is if nobody uses them.
Okay, but a thought occurred to me as I was reflecting for our chat when we had interviewed CDP director Brian King on this show some months back.
Yep.
And you know it was what the French call esprit d'escalier, the spirit of the stairs, a question I wished I had asked him, but only realized as I was walking out
As
the
you were
stairs of the
walking up,
party. And the question is, have you ever smoked cigarettes? And it occurs to me that I seriously doubt that any of the FDA leadership and any of the people in tobacco control have ever smoked cigarettes. I myself smoked a pack of Marlboro Light cigarettes every day for 25 years. And many millions of Americans, just like me, for the last number of years have had the option at 7-Elevens and convenience stores and other retailers for years now to either pick Marlboro Lights or 22nd Century's VLN cigarettes. And nobody is buying the VLN cigarettes. That's the reason they're going bankrupt. And I am here to tell you, maybe just speaking anecdotally for myself, if FDA got its way, instituted that standard, and Marlboro Lights, FDA market approved Marlboro Lights, had de minimis nicotine, I would absolutely, positively, 100,000% buy them on the black market for sure. And you know what
hmm,
else? There are Mexican and Canadian and Chinese and other traffickers who will be delighted to sell me a pack of old-fashioned Marlboro Lights, and I would buy them. So what's going to stop that from happening?
So maybe this might be a helpful exercise. Uh, Imagine, and I've already lost my bet with Clive on this rule.
Hmm.
And maybe I should take advantage of this opportunity. The non-money terms was for me to declare that I am an ass and always have been and always will be, which is fine. Um, but I think it's worth thinking, let's put ourselves forward to 2027.
Hmm.
What does a Powerwall in a Sheetz or a Casey's look like?
Yeah.
What do you see on that wall? I can tell you what I see on that wall. You tell me what you see on that wall.
I think the way that things are going now, I would expect it'll be, I suppose, very low nicotine cigarettes and the brands we're all familiar with, along with one section for the approved Zyn pouch products, good for them. Another section for the small handful of antiquated, outdated, obsolete vape products that they have approved. And then behind the store, in the parking lot behind the store, will be a white unmarked van that has, old fashioned, unstamped, untaxed Marlboro Lights and Salem menthols and every disposable vape you could feast your eyes on.
So that's a vivid image. I too, I'm able to see that. And if if I thought that was what it was going to be, then I would agree with you that this is not a good policy
You
and should not
doubt
be
the black
pursued.
market's going to emerge? I mean, Brian King and Dr. Califf had a webinar just 2 days
Yes.
ago to talk about this, which I watched, and they were asked that question in the most timid, genuflecting way by the three, count 'em, journalists that showed up for the affair, and they both waved it off in the most blasé fashion. Oh, black market? Doubt it, probably not. And if so, they put forward this ludicrous moral calculus. Even if that happens, the benefit that we expect to see will far outweigh it. It's just complete apples and oranges comparison that makes no sense
Mm,
empirically, morally, in any fashion. At any rate,
mm,
in their dreamy-eyed view, the benefit will be so great that no one's going to care about the black market. And I'm like, have you guys ever read or understood anything about the history of black markets in this country? I mean, again, talk about running the experiment. I mean, honest to Christmas, the naivete of it was just staggering.
I that is a worry that important decision makers on the public health and tobacco control side are willing to dismiss the argument that illicit markets will be prepared to meet this need. Um, uh, the trite way that that is handled is, well, that's an industry argument, and that's where the discussion stops.
May I tell you,
Um,
not 100 yards from where I sit right now in New York City, you can walk to any number of dozen or more bodegas and smoke shops and buy black market untaxed Marlboro Light cigarettes any day of the week. More black market cigarettes, I believe, are sold in this state than legal ones. So it's not, I mean, industry argument. It's like, what are you talking about? There's a reality, a daily reality.
so I would have us just um, kind of ground ourselves in the uh, acceptance that reasonable people who view the world differently can look at the exact same things and draw very different conclusions.
I noticed that and I sense that. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, I think you're right, and I want to get us onto our other topics, but
Okay.
it would be curious to see how it plays out because the viability of it as a procedure, whether the rule will go through, whether the Trump administration will um, roll it back, I don't know. I mean, I know you said on Twitter you accept their sincerity in wishing it, and take them at their word that, as Dr. Kalo said, is the most important accomplishment in his career. I myself regard it the way that, to borrow a phrase from the great American statesman William Seward, as, quote, the last shriek on the retreat. So
Well,
we'll see if it actually comes to pass.
we will, and so I guess, and maybe if you want to find another time, I do think it could be very effective, and maybe it's more important with having people who are more directly involved in the marketplace to have the discussion of it's 2027. What does a marketplace that is governed by voluntary compliance look like? And it would not look like what you're describing. And if that is all that the Powerwall holds, I completely agree with you, and it will be really bad.
You're making me think I'll invite my friend Faviola, who runs the bodega down the street where I buy my counterfeit jewel pods, and we'll get her. I expect she'll be very enthused, because business is, unlike 22nd century, business for her is looking up. Um, that wasn't the only important
Mm,
policy legal matter that took place in the last few days. There was also, as we all recall, the Supreme Court hearing on the wages and White Line versus FDA case, more commonly known as the Triton case. And the Supreme Court is now considering what was heard in oral arguments and the briefs and the state of the policy. They will meet soon, in what's called judicial conference, when all the nine justices get together to deliberate and begin to arrive at their votes and their view, which will be expressed in an opinion we expect to come. I've circled sort of April 1st as our as the date, when it's around, when it's most likely to happen.
that seems apt.
Yeah, exactly. It does. That would actually be, yeah, the irony there would be great. Um, and there's a lot of mixed views on it. And I guess I would open that up, sort of a double pronged question. What's your forecast there, and how impactful, how game changing will it be if the court rules, strongly in favor of the vape manufacturers?
Mm. So I'm going to disappoint, which I'm very practiced at, which is I don't claim I'm not even unfrozen caveman lawyer.
Yeah.
I'm just not in a position to like postulate on this. Obviously,
Everyone has a view, and we know in tobacco control, use Michael Bloomberg's method. Always, often wrong, never in doubt. Just proceed.
no, no, no. Even with your encouragement, I'm gonna show the discretion and wisdom that will shock anyone who knows me. But no, I mean, uh, it, I, I guess my hope would be that things, the outlook of the agency, the perspective of important stakeholders advance to a point where that decision is not as relevant as it was once considered to be.
Let's jump ahead then, because that touches on our next topic here. I mean, my forecast is guarded optimism. I think there was a
Well,
lot
guarded optimism
that the court will side strongly with the vape companies.
and the consequence of that will be,
The consequence of that will be that I think that CTP will have to start from scratch in establishing the PMTA process and how it's measured.
so which is what they wanted to do and asked for time to do in 2017, right? That was a central part of the comprehensive plan. The public health community found that unacceptable and litigated that.
Yeah,
FDA lost.
yeah.
And uh, the outcome of that acceleration in timing, I think, was bad for everybody.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to say why it would be different this time around if the outcome is that CTP has to start all over again.
Well, because of course,
Now, again, that's from my standpoint as someone who, potentially stupidly believes that there's a positive impact of good regulation for health and for a market. But
I hear that, yes, and I've followed that closely as well. I mean, there's a school of thought that thinks FDA sort of secretly wants to lose because the courts will force them to do what they wish to do in the first place, but couldn't in the face of all that withering opposition from the tobacco control community. And if that's the case, no one will cheer louder, pat them on the back harder than me if they finally get down to doing the right thing without complaint. But the reason it'll happen and the mechanism that will oblige that is that uh, the federal courts will enforce it if they don't make a standard that is reasonable. In other words, that lets participants all have a decent chance. That's empirical, measurable, stated upfront, and unchanging. And three, that is transparent in its mechanism so that any American can see how they did it, all of which is behind the curtain right now, ever changing, capricious, and done under a voodoo standard that is 100% subjective. If they don't do it the proper way that SCOTUS lays out ostensibly, then any manufacturer can go to a federal court in any state in this country and say, "Hey, Your Honor, FDA told these guys to shape up, and they treated me badly," and that court will issue an injunction on the spot.
and I'll just nod my head knowingly as if I understood more than 40% of what you just said.
Well, here's the bigger question
Yeah.
that we can touch on, which is, there's a new administration. It's going to be a new head of Health and Human Services, new head of FDA.
Mm,
Dr. Califf effectively said his goodbyes just a couple days ago, and
yep.
I wish him well on the board of whatever drug company he decamps to. And the question is whether you sense an emerging vibe shift, as the journalists like to say. Is there a new outlook? I mean, in that webinar, for example, Dr. Califf and Dr. King both said, "Oh, well, the VLN standard is part of making America healthy again," and they were overtly appealing to the, MAGA philosophy of the
Hmm.
incoming administration.
Yes.
And indeed, the pouch decision, the timing is pretty noticeable there, right as the new administration is coming in. Do you sense that there's a kind of cultural shift that may be emerging at FDA? Or, to take the cynical view, are they simply, you know, just making the right motions to try to protect their bureaucratic sinecures?
So, with the caveats that I'm only like 20% through the proposed rule, I haven't read the TPL for Zinn yet. I'm
Yeah.
kind of embarrassed, to present myself as expert on anything with those disclosures, but here we are. Um, I was taken by the bolded in his own voice quote from Dr. Califf. And I think if you contrast what he said, just the few words in that quote, to his position, I think in the fall of 2019 in AAMC's newsletter, where he laid out a two-part, here's how we deal with vaping products. That's a pretty substantial uh, evolution in thinking.
Is it? I
Oh
mean,
my gosh.
well,
Oh my gosh.
let me rephrase that. It is. My question is, more accurately, was it sincere? I went back and looked actually at some of the other
I
things that
think
Caleb had said in recent months about vaping and low risk nicotine products, and it was like boilerplate off of the
uh,
PFK Twitter feed.
And fair. And what I would say, Jim, is these are not, I mean, and again, I'm a liberal, progressive, squish, whatever. Um, the incentives for these people to not be sincere, I mean, the incentives for them to be sincere and forthright and truthful are enormous. So,
So by your lights, Dr. Caleb, despite all of the trash talking misinfo he's been spouting about vaping over the last 3, 4 years, despite that, you sense that in the last, I guess, whatever, few weeks or months, he's come to Jesus and now thinks that low risk nicotine products are, the right thing to do.
now I'll tell you what I would wish for. And this goes, this, if we wanted to digress into this, with the challenge that our institutions across health, across science have suffered reputational blows, and the public is not trusting them. There's a real tension. How do you rebuild that trust? My view is, and I heard this at a conference recently, I can't remember the physician's name who made this point, but essentially, um, we want institutions to behave in a trustworthy manner. That's the way you rebuild trust. And it would have been great were Commissioner Califf to have laid out the progression of his thinking as opposed to
Yeah,
just present I'm willing to say there'll be
yeah,
lower risk, lower
yeah,
harm. I think he even said lower harm
yeah,
products,
yeah,
not
yeah.
lower risk, even lower harm
Right,
products.
right.
I about fell out of my chair when I read that.
Yeah.
So I think it is best to take that as a sincere reflection, as something that that he would want to carry forward into the new administration. And I think there is a tremendous opportunity to advance a world where smoke is no longer the vehicle that people use to consume nicotine, and they're getting it in much less harmful ways. And I
Well,
think this is what's possible if we seize this moment.
well, let me give you a view. If you're a squish progressive, I'm a full moon libertarian, and not to be
That's
taken
a
serious,
great description. That was very vivid.
not to be
Very
taken
vivid.
seriously by any side of the aisle. And but I've got a lot of contacts in the transition team, and there is an effort in motion now. The FDA leadership has already been served with formal legal papers that they are instructed to preserve all of their records, especially their communications, emails, texts on
Sure.
both their official and on their personal devices, because the bureaucrats will often set up a Gmail account or use their personal cell phones in order to evade freedom of information. They've been
Hmm.
instructed to preserve all those records, and that's happening in other agencies too. And the expectation is that at some point in the near future, all of that material is going to be bundled together and put online in an open source fashion. You'll recall that when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he did something very similar and put all those documents online and
Yep.
allowed the public to sift through them. And based on what AVM intends to do, what I intend to do, I've spoken with people that focus on these kind of FDA policies at the conservative think tanks. There is going to be a posse riding out bent on recrimination, and they are going to sort through all of the dialogue that Dr. Califf and Dr. King have ever had with the likes of American Lung Association,
Hmm.
TFK, Vital Strategies, Michael Bloomberg, all these people, and there is going to be a reckoning like you haven't seen before at that agency. And you know, I don't know. I mean, I hear your goodwill, and I would like to try to take them at their word. I find it
Well,
extremely.
do you? But that's the
I don't.
question.
I
Is
don't.
that?
No, I
Well, no,
don't.
no, but that's different. Can you sincerely say that you would like to take them at their word?
Oh, I'd
Or
love
would
nothing
you
more.
rather,
I would like nothing more than if Dr. King and Caleb had a genuine conversion to the principles of
okay,
tobacco harm reduction. Not even like precisely mine, but just in general. But I all evidence is to the contrary. All interaction we've had with them is to the contrary. Their every step throughout,
yeah, no,
notwithstanding what they said two
still,
days ago, speaks otherwise. And so it's hard to
so
believe.
let me, yeah, so, uh, I'm not an expert at that sort of stuff either. Uh, and I'm channeling, if folks haven't watched it, it is tremendous. Um, Peter Sandman, who's a mostly retired risk communications expert, gave a lecture at, I think it was a Heterodox Academy sponsored event on what did we learn from COVID, and he talked about experts
They're great. Yeah.
and limits of expertise, and it's just a really powerful thing. So I'm actually trying to remember his point about you think you may know something and you pop off about so, acknowledging that I'm at risk of popping off here, but um, I can't help but see the parallels of the work that's done to examine industry documents, whether it's fossil
Yeah,
fuels, opioids.
yeah,
My name appears pretty frequently in the Jewel documents.
mine too.
Um, and uh, I keep having a quote from the sage Lily Tomlin come through my head, and that is forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past.
You've mentioned that.
Now, yes, now that's too simplistic because I do think learning from history and trying to understand where could things have gone differently and how to reduce the risk that problems happen again, that has to be done. Um, but I think it doesn't help when folks on the industry side are held to the standards of what was done in the past as absolute 100% predictors of how they will behave in the future. I think that same policy applies to uh, federal officials. And
Here's
based,
another way to think about it. I mean, there's going to be a new policy direction at HHS and FDA. Where it goes, I think, is unknown. I think that you know, the philosophical aimings of the Trump administration are a little bit of a crapshoot. It's very hard to get a sense of where they're headed on these big questions. But it's going to be,
Mhm.
it's safe to say, drastically different from what's happened during the Biden
Mm,
administration.
mm,
And those policies, the transition team, I think, believes those policies are going to be a lot easier to put in motion and get rolling, especially in the first 100 days, as administrations wish to do, if they can show that the policies pursued by their predecessors were corrupt, and that generates public anger, and it shows that they're cleaning up the stables. And you and I both know full well in the THR community, there is a great deal, I'd say it's the predominant feeling, is a feeling of righteous anger toward FDA. Clive Bates, our mutual friend, has done a whole great paper on why tobacco control and FDA need to recognize that and understand why ordinary Americans legitimately feel that way.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so the administration has an incentive to do that reckoning. The grassroots Americans who take part in THR and who use nicotine want to see that happen. So to borrow a line from the great Cormac McCarthy in his book No Country for Old Men, um, he says, you can't stop what's coming. It ain't all waiting on you. And so this is something that's going to happen, like it or not. I am keen to take part, as I think you can tell, but I fear Lily Tomlin's sage caution may be lost in the wind.
So I'm really glad you generated the physical response to mentioning No Country for Old Men as one of the most horrifying books that I've ever read. So that's a good framing. Um, uh, I guess there it's a matter of balance. If retribution and justice and vengeance become the overweening goals of any particular effort such as this, I think we lose sight of the people that we're ostensibly trying to help.
Well, let me ask you, if it, let's say that that unfolds as I've described, and it turns out there is, you know, prima facie evidence of FDA leadership actively collaborating with tobacco control entities in how they will, let's say, measure the science in the PMTA process and
Hmm.
what they ought to do. That is, let's just stipulate that is unlawful. That's against the law for outside parties to do that, influence agencies in that collusive fashion. If it turns out that actually happened, which I strongly suspect it did, but let's say hypothetically that happened, wouldn't that make you angry too? Wouldn't that bother? Wouldn't you be offended by that kind of law breaking on an issue that we've been working on for so long?
So that's an easy one to answer. And from the exact opposite place, which is there's nothing that undercuts my goal of having a credible, reliable regulator governing the way a market unfolds than to have this sort of
Yeah,
evidence appear. So um, it's so yes.
yeah. I'm reminded somehow, it's a drastic, a different example. I'm reminded of the early 1970s when, after the Nixon administration, they Senate convened what were called the Church hearings, named after the chairman, Senator Frank Church, and they looked back at how the FBI and the American intelligence community had spied on Americans and had investigated Americans using unconstitutional methods. And a lot of heads rolled. I mean, the number two guy at FBI was convicted of federal crimes, um, and many of his colleagues also. And it
Mm,
led to wholesale changes at those agencies and ones that have endured, I hasten to add. Um, so it wouldn't be the first time that kind of, retrospective review had happened with an eye toward restoring the trust that Americans rightly expect
mm,
from those agencies. So I'm going to
mm,
be curious to see how that unfolds.
mm.
I don't know, but that's one I'm keeping an eye on.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'll be interested to have the benefit of your work in that research.
I'll try to mangle the metaphor. I'll try to reel my horse back and stay at the rear of the posse and refrain from shooting
Well,
willy-nilly as they see in the movies.
yeah, I mean, I'm just let me just express the gratitude that we're in a nation where this kind of stuff is the way the expectations for government are that high, and I
I
hope
think
it
that,
stays
and
that
there's,
way.
I'll give you a silver lining of my own, which is evidenced by the conversation we're having right now. In the tobacco harm reduction movement, there has always been a wide ecumenical range of perspectives,
Hmm.
political perspectives, even moral perspectives.
Hmm.
And yet we have always been able to air those in a congenial fashion and listen to different parts of that debate. And yes, even change our minds, I think. I'd like to think. And
Hmm.
so hopefully, Joe, that openness and that willing to have challenging and sharing public discourse will be a moderating effect on whatever retrospective review happens about how we got here.
Well, and I can't resist stealing from a short clip of Jonathan Haidt, who you've heard me
Yes.
recommend his work. But I think he's addressing, it must be an audience of students. And he says to the audience, I'm going to ask a question. I want you to think about it a bit and then just start shouting out answers.
Right.
And he says, how does it feel to be wrong?
Oh, right. Yeah.
And there's a beat, and then people are like, embarrassed,
Hmm.
angry, frustrated, ashamed. And he's like, okay, I hear all of those. That sounds like what it feels like to discover that you're wrong. And that's the problem. Being
Yeah.
wrong feels exactly like being right up
Yeah.
until the moment that you discover that you're wrong. The most efficient way to find out that you're wrong is to interact with people who see the world differently than you. And if we can hold to that and not be confused by being in rooms where everyone agrees with us and thinking that means that we're right,
Yeah.
and because it does feel the same, and it's great to have people agree with us. But if it's not the right people agreeing with us, we've just fooled ourselves.
Well, listeners can draw their own conclusions by the fact that you're quoting books from Jonathan Haidt and Lily Tomlin, and I'm quoting ones about High Country Outlaw and six shooting sheriffs. Listeners, make your own minds who seems more appealing. Uh,
Exactly.
that gets us to our next question, which is whether you sense there's a vibe shift in the state of the science. Now, here your expertise far eclipses my any that I might pretend to, and I wonder whether you think. I mean, to touch on our friend Clive Bates again, the other
Sure.
day did a terrific podcast with our colleague um,
Brent,
with Brent
Brent Stafford.
Stafford, yes,
Yep.
and in which he pointed out that it's easy he collects all of the latest science on nicotine policy writ large,
Hmm.
and said it is easy to spot any paper that comes out of the United States. He says you can spot it from space because it's so obviously slanted. Do you sense a vibe shift or a shift in focus and a shift in direction in the scientific community, or do you expect perhaps that will happen?
So, one, I would, maybe this shows my patriotism. I would push back against our former overlord uh, descendant, that that's true about a lot of papers, but it's not true about Matt Carpenter's papers showing that Wegenberg or
Sure.
Tracy Smith's or Ted Wagner's. I mean, so
Little
let's not
Floxons.
get uh, 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 dear colleague and incredible polymath. Um, so I think that's too broad a brush. Uh, I think the more that the scientific field grapples and actually tries to wrestle with these competing findings in the way that science can, that is good. Um, I think efforts to try to restrict and exile research and researchers, I think those are counterproductive to a search for truth. Um, so I do think that, I mean, of course I would, given all of my biases. I think as the science has accumulated, it's hard to quibble with the Cochrane review saying we have high confidence that nicotine containing vapor products are more effective than NRT products. And the argument against that has evolved to, well, maybe that's so, but look at my meta-analysis of 104 studies showing that the disease, you may have more
Yeah.
quitting, but you're not going to have less death.
Yeah.
And that's a persuasive argument to people who want to believe it and
What about like at NIH, for example, which,
has a
has
clear,
notoriously been unwilling to study vaping as a method of quitting cigarettes. And there's a new head of NIH who thinks radically different from the current,
yep.
power structure there. Do you expect that will lead in a shift in their research focus to include THR concepts?
So again, venturing deep into my ignorance, uh, one would hope so. I do think it's important to appreciate the distinctions within NIH. There are two main institutes that fund most of this work, the Cancer Institute and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I think the research coming out of those two funding streams is a little bit different. And I would encourage people to look at like that study Kaja et al. Analysis of path. Uh, I wouldn't expect that sort of work to come from the Cancer Institute. So,
Yeah.
it's good to have a range of views. And hopefully that whatever the new political leadership at NIH fosters an environment where that is valued, not squelched.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm there. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic too, and it doesn't take directed policy making to let that happen. The scientific community can follow their own curiosity, to borrow one of your virtues,
Yep.
and to follow the research where it leads if they're, if they have the shackles taken off. And so, here's hoping that uh, curiosity prevails. And that sort of gets us to the last of my bullets, which was on the expectations for the media coverage of all of the above. Um, and it's so striking to me. I keep trying to think that I should try to inject myself and do a talk at one of the nicotine forums about the media coverage, because if you notice, Joe, nearly every speaker, to my ears at least, a large plurality of them touch on how the media coverage, news media coverage of THR and vaping issues and low risk nicotine and smoking is the biggest single factor that's happening in the public discourse. It's what's led more than 80% of Americans to wrongly conclude that vaping is as dangerous as smoking. And you listen to any of these major luminaries in our world talk about that. Ken Warner at Michigan, for example, Doc David Abrams at NYU. I mean, all the most esteemed thinkers get up and give their talks. Clive Bates, too. And there'll be a slide on there that laments to the church rafters how wrong and irresponsible the media coverage has been. And of course, I feel that way too. Anyone who's followed American vapor manufacturers knows our threads where we do deep dive media criticism to try to unpack and pull apart the specific ways that these
Mm.
journalists rig the coverage.
Mm.
And so, where is it headed? Where is that headed? I mean, you saw some glimpses of it in the coverage in the last 48 hours about the Zinn decision.
Yep.
Um, but to my mind, it didn't nearly go far enough. I mean, again, there were only three journalists at the Caliph and King presser. I mean, you'd think those guys would be clamoring for the chance to ask Dr. King and Dr. Caliph questions on his way
Well,
out the door.
but
Um,
so it was interesting, just as a side note, I saw something at least that billed it as a recording of Caliph. And so I
oh no,
was
no,
surprised. Well, I know he was live,
it
but
was
I thought,
recorded and presented later, but journalists were invited
no,
to
no, no, I know,
ask
I
questions.
watched. No, 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 to be here, let me be clear. I
Yeah,
thought I saw something that it was Caliph was going to appear by recording. When it actually ran, he was there live.
that's right.
And I wonder
Yeah,
if busy journalists were like, I don't need to watch Commissioner Califf from a recording. So I
well,
fear that may, and I don't know how that occurred. That just, it struck me as that could be part of the
I
explanation.
wonder.
So
I mean,
let me,
if
let,
CBS News and our friend Nick Florco at the Atlantic were savvy enough to patch in, you'd think that I don't know AP's Matt Perrone or New York Times Christina Jewett, who are normally on high alert for any utterance from Dr. Caliph, would have been aware. I don't know.
so I, and we don't have a lot of time left. And such an important topic.
Yeah,
And it's one where I do have views and beliefs that are also kind of deep into the frontier of my ignorance, but I'm gonna go for it. I tried to, I made a comment, I can't remember, on some social media thing, asking people to look at coverage of the announcement of the proposed rule and evaluate whether it framed things as Manichaean and good and evil or something a little more complicated.
yeah.
And I have to concede, I was pretty I mean, not surprised, but so disappointed that perhaps the best example of Manichaean coverage came from my primary news source at NPR.
Interesting. Did it?
Miss Noguchi's story, it had, I think, a lung association spokesperson, and it had a convenience store association spokesperson, and then it had someone from Big Cities, Big Health
Yeah,
Coalition at the tail.
yeah,
And, there is this real dynamic of when you present to the public the deep extremes of viewpoint.
yeah,
It's no wonder that people are confused and wondering this doesn't make any sense or that
yeah,
sort of jazz. Where was the call to a Ken Warner? Where
yeah.
was the call to the people who have really wrestled with this a lot? So
Or an
I,
ordinary American.
well, and that is the place of that's a totally fair point. I guess I'd want to make sure they got to experts who had the standing at least first and the experience and basis. But yes, it would be nice to have the people impacted to have a chance to comment too.
I'm so glad you brought up NPR because I don't think there's any better example, object lesson for how the press has gotten this coverage wrong than that particular outlet. They exhibit every single one of the worst, most irresponsible instincts of journalism in their coverage of vaping products. It is routinely and consistently hostile to
There,
any
there,
THR.
there, I would almost entirely agree, which why when there are exceptions, like it just came to my mind, there was a piece from WHYY, not from the mothership, but
Yeah,
from out that was a
yeah,
thoughtful, nuanced take. And it's like,
yeah,
oh, this is exactly what we
right.
need more people to wrestle with. And what is frustrating is, as one of their audience, the what I see as the true story of
Yeah.
nicotine and society would be fascinating for the audience.
Counterintuitive, interesting for for listeners,
And people would
compelling.
learn, and it matters. This is not an esoteric, you know, where's all the dark matter in the universe? Not that I have anything against the physicists studying stuff like that, but these are, we have a chance to change people's lives in a
And
great way.
I've been trying mightily, Joe, for the last 4 years to try to dialogue with NPR. I've reached out to
Oh, which you've documented, and it's a exercise in frustration,
It's
and
been
I'm
unbelievable. They actually have one of their reporters specializes in covering addiction, and that's his primary beat. And and he's invites listeners. Hey, I want to hear from everybody. I want to hear from the subjects of our stories. NPR is always open to listening, don't you know? We own up to our biases if someone points them out to us. I invite your questions, and we're right there in the thread saying, ahem, could we please dialogue with you about THR? There's a lot you're getting wrong, we think, and it's just complete crickets.
so I guess where I would think about that is I am more comfortable assuming that the actual people involved with all of this are just the kind of people that we want them to be. And the question then is, what are the forces that are um, playing with them and playing on them that lead them to decide this is the story I'm going to pursue?
I wonder if maybe the answer to that question is the tens of millions of dollars that they get from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, one of the most
But but
stridently
even
anti-vape advocacy groups in the world.
but even you saw Dr. Besser's quote, and maybe it was at the end of the CBS story or something, where even that I was willing to see a kernel of open-mindedness, where he said about the VLN rule, I think, paraphrasing, I wish it would cover more of these products, but at least if it does combustibles, that would be good. Read that and I was like, hallelujah, hallelujah.
What?
You know, the reason why that
Hallelujah.
matters, the reason why that matters, Jim, is the break from the orthodoxy, as small as that, I'm willing to believe is the kind of catalyst that will lead people to be like, are other people publishing on this? Oh, yes. Actually, here's the work from the UK, the Cochrane. Wait, there's a Cochrane review? Nobody told me there's a Cochrane review
They
on
know
this?
full well they're
No,
suppressing it,
no,
Joe.
no, no, no. The way humans work is we're motivated reasoners. We attend to the stuff that confirms our beliefs and we ignore utterly the stuff that does not. And unless someone has a reason to actually go digging, you mean I'm going to speak and not know that there's a Cochrane review? Who is staffing me? You know, I start channeling, you know, certain senators from Minnesota who are known for their, you know, expressions of uh, derision.
Well,
Um,
if you're an NPR reporter whose beat is addiction or public health, and you're routinely covering issues like vaping, and you are oblivious to the fact that there's a Cochrane review on it, then maybe you shouldn't be in journalism.
nah, dude. Uh, I mean, this is not just us. This is a challenge in our society broadly with taboos and, you know, the Richard Feynman. I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. Um, you know, as I noted on the Twitter earlier about this We've Never Been Woke book, it
Yeah.
really, you know, he's not talking about our issue, but he's talking about the underpinnings that help to explain, I think, why we are where we are. And we need to somehow, you know, what's the other Lincoln quote? Goodness, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better.
Right, right,
Right?
right, right,
And
right.
until we're there,
Yeah.
we're gonna keep being frustrated as to why are we going around and having the same discussions.
Well, let me try to wrap with a good example of how that can actually work and what we might aspire to, which is on Twitter today. You and I were kicking around um, how there have been some good articles in the, I think it's fair to say, left-leaning Mother Jones magazine, one of the flagships of the progressive movement, sticking up for tobacco harm reduction and casting a withering eye on the world of tobacco control and their motivations. At the same time, what I pointed out is, who else has been airing a lot of that great stuff is their polar ideological opposite, um, uh, my number one news source, which is the Wall Street Journal editorial page, um, home of free market capitalisms and flagship of business and capitalism. And they too have presented op-eds and institutional editorials, and importantly, letters to the editor from ordinary Americans
Yep.
talking about how they have used vaping to quit cigarettes, and from physicians who say, I have been recommending this to my patients who are unable to quit smoking, something you see nowhere else in the national news
Mm.
media.
Mm.
And if the full on progressives, committed progressives at Mother Jones and my capitalist true believers at the Wall Street Journal editorial page can both be presenting that, there I think it lies the hope and the example of how we might break through the orthodoxy and start having an honest conversation with the American public.
Amen.
Well, it's a good place to wrap it, Joe. Thanks again for your time. This is, as ever, our conversations are to be continued. Um,
I
and
hope so.
I know, well, a lot of these events are yet to play out, so we'll see how they unfold, and we'll come back and do that, and I'll bring my bodega owner friend, and you can bring some upper
Yeah,
Northwest the progressives, and when we'll let the enlightenment unfold.
I love it. Big, braver angels energy.
Very, very exactly. All right, kind thanks. Our guest has been Joe Gitchell from Pinney and Associates. I'm Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers, and we'll see you next time.